this about Christianity, or is this about who gets to own the brand?
It's about who gets to own the brand, 100% about that. And, men like Pete Hexus, pastor, like Doug Wilson, like Joel Webbin, like Scott Yenner, like William Wolfe, those men have built a power structure for themselves. It has nothing to do with faith or Christianity or belief in Jesus or any other God, and everything to do with making themselves as gods, and that's really in the clip that we'll show about William Wolfe, what he's doing. I'm going to impose my morality on you. It's God's, and I have to check myself to make sure that I'm being faithful to God. But how do you do that? Unless God comes down and tells everybody, this is really the person that is speaking for me. You can't say, even what Tallarico does in trying to speak for Jesus. He was in a church service, and that's what people do in church services.
Yeah, sure.
But it's I try very hard in my work not to speak for that.
Right.
Because it's not my place to do that. It's my place to interpret whatever I want to believe and apply it to my life and my choices as well as I can, and leave everybody else alone. But that doesn't give white Christian men power.
No.
And this is the same dynamic. If you strip away the gods we're talking about, the religion we're talking about that killed a pregnant woman and her baby in Afghanistan and left 8 children motherless. It's the same dynamic. It's the same power structure being applied.
Absolutely. And I think, going back to the Tallarico invoking Jesus, I think it makes me a little bit cringy. And when anybody says, what Jesus would have wanted? Like, I don't care what Jesus wanted. You do these things because they're right. Right. You do them because you're a human being. And there are other human beings who we have a social contract with that's currently fractured and destroyed. And this is the thing. The social contract in a place like Afghanistan under the Taliban works among a chosen few, right? The men, the religious men. The social contract that you and I envision, it doesn't matter to me if Jesus said it. I don't care, right? The social contract ought to work for all of us. That's where we are.
And that's what our country was founded upon.
Yes.
It was founded upon this principle of the social contract applies to everyone, regardless of religion. I don't know that our founders really believed that, because as we talked about before, they were a bunch of rich white men and thought it was okay for people to own people, and thought it was okay to take away land from people who'd been here forever and all of that. But they didn't think women were people. But still, they made an experiment to try to say, we want to create some place where religion is not going to be imposed on everyone as part of our laws.
Yeah. And I guess that's maybe another thing. I think Tallarico's great. He's very talented. And everything he's saying is, yeah, exactly. But when you're fighting over who gets to define Jesus, I think you're missing the whole point, right? And I think the Christian nationalists understand that. I think they want to fight over Jesus. That would be great if we could have that conversation about who owns Jesus, rather than the conversation about women shouldn't vote or or any of this stuff. I feel like, going back to social contract, this does feel like a project to redraft that social contract from the very foundation, the extremist foundation, upward. Do you, and also not just the project to re-envision and redraft the social contract, but to assign to hire the authors to do it?
Well, this has been a 50-year project that, it really has always been a project in this country. You know, these are the same people who fought for the South in the Civil War. These are the same people who thought it was fine to put Native Americans on reservations. These are the same people who thought it was okay to own people. Mm-hmm. And they used a lot of the same justifications for that these people are doing. You know, it was interesting, and this is an aside, you can cut it out if you want to, but tomorrow I'm interviewing Larissa Reinhardt, who wrote a biography on Jeanette Rankin. And as I've been reading that book, I've been so taken by how in the late 1800s, originalism was a thing.
Right.
You know, we act like it was a thing that Leonard Leo invented.
Right.
But originalism was a thing, and it worked, and they were trying to make the judiciary just care about the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and all the robber barons and all of that and all the corruption, and protect all of that. And they used this concept of the purity of the law and the original meaning and all of that to do that. And I mean, that was the first time I'd gone, you know, this is a cycle that we have gone through again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
In this country. And so I don't know what it's going to take for people to understand that men like we're showing you in these videos only care about their own power.
Yes.
And they will fight. I said this in 2024, some version of a 30 years war that killed 8 million people in Europe that we know about, which is one of the things that led to the founding of the United States. You know, they'll fight something like that once they feel like they've consolidated power, because Brooks Pottinger doesn't agree with Mike Huckabee about who's going to heaven. He doesn't agree with J.D. Vance about who's going to heaven. You know, they don't agree about theology.